Number 12. High Standard HDM Suppressed Pistol. Canvas straps bite into your shoulders, silk snaps overhead. France is a black cutout beneath your boots. In the leg bag against your thigh is not a carbine, not a Thompson, but a .22 target pistol stretched into something stranger. A High Standard HDM with a steel tube almost 8 inches long. 10 rounds, no muzzle flash to betray a hedgerow, no crack to wake a village. Inside its barrel, 44 tiny holes bleed gas away so a sentry can die with barely more noise than a cough. It was built for men who landed wrong, moved alone, and needed one body on the ground without the whole map catching fire. By D-Day, pistols like this were reaching the Shadow War, Jedburgh teams, OSS stations, night missions. Now you're lower. The silk is still above you, but the ground has shape. Hedgerows, a lane, a stand of trees blacker than the fields around them. The leg bag knocks your thigh as you drift, and for one clean second the whole thing feels absurd. A pistol born as a neat little training gun in America, now hanging under a parachute over occupied France. On November 22, 1943, in New Haven, Connecticut, the government handed High Standard a contract for 1,500 of them. Not parade pistols, not holster pieces for officers. Suppressed Model HDs in .22 long rifle, built for the Office of Strategic Services. For men landing at night, crossing fences, cutting wires, finding resistance contacts, and sometimes meeting a sentry before they met a friend. Your boots hit hard. Not a graceful landing. One foot sinks in wet earth. Your shoulder twists. You go down in the crop rows with a grunt that sounds louder than gunfire in your own ears. Chute drags once, then collapses. For a moment there is only breathing. Fast, ragged. Then the practiced motions return. Pop the harness, gather silk, check the lane, check the hedge. Listen. Nothing. You drag the parachute into the ditch and crouch over the leg bag. The buckle is cold under your fingers. Inside is the pistol, wrapped to keep mud out of the action, and the long steel tube from picking up dirt. You pull it free. In the dark, it feels oddly heavy for its caliber. 2 pounds 15 ounces of steel and, hush, nearly 13.815 inches from the back strap to the front of the suppressor. It is longer than a service pistol has any right to be. This one is not meant to win a duel. It is meant to erase the first shot. You thumb the magazine. 10 rounds. Small cartridges, and that is the point. The barrel is perforated. 44 holes, each one 1/8 of an inch, spaced 1/4 inch apart. So gas can bleed off into the tube around it, and the bullet can stay tame enough not to crack the night apart. The suppressor is narrow, less than 1 inch across, a 7.75-inch steel cylinder packed to do one job. High Standard claimed a 90% reduction in sound. In training, men were told it was quiet enough to use close to enemy quarters without lighting up the countryside. Quiet enough if everything inside was clean. So you do not fire it to test it. Men practiced with ordinary High Standard pistols because this one used itself up by degrees. 20 rounds, and it wanted cleaning. 250, and the bronze screen inside might need replacing. Silence came with maintenance. The arithmetic was brutal. Carry it for days, maybe weeks, to fire it once. Dog barks somewhere beyond the orchard. Then another answers. You freeze. The pistol is in your hand now, the long tube balanced under your palm, and every part of it feels deliberate. The small magazine, the mild recoil, the familiar grip of a target pistol chosen because men could shoot it well. This is not a sidearm for charging anything. It is a tool for the distance between one breath and the next. By January 20th, 1944, regular deliveries had already begun. Within a week, the pistol had been shown in Algiers. On February 1st, 20 went to General Douglas MacArthur, and 6 of those were passed to the Alamo Scouts, men who moved through jungle the way OSS teams moved through Europe, quietly, in fragments, too far from help. They used it on sentries, but also for food. The margin was that narrow. The same little silenced pistol that could kill a guard could also bring down a meal without drawing a patrol. You slip through a gap in the hedge. The field beyond is silvered faintly by cloud-broken moonlight. A farmhouse sits low and square, perhaps 150 yards away. One lamp burns behind a shutter. To your left, a lane. To your right, stacked hay and a wagon. Somewhere past all of that is the contact point, the resistance man, the radio, the instructions folded into oilskin. Between here and there are the ordinary risks that ruin clandestine work long before any grand sabotage begins. A farmer awake too late, a bicycle on the road, boots at the wrong gate. Then you see him. Not a dramatic silhouette, just a man standing by the lane where it meets the farm wall, helmet edge faintly catching what little light there is. A sentry, because he is still when everything else moves. Sentry because your whole body knows it before your mind says the word. You drop behind the wagon wheel and breathe through your nose. The range is short, 30 feet, maybe less if you cut across the ditch. With a louder gun, this becomes a different night instantly. One shot and the farmhouse wakes. Two shots and a truck could be on the road inside minutes. With a rifle, you would have reach but not secrecy. With a knife, you need his posture, his route, the luck of the dark. This is the distance the strange American pistol was built for. The sentry turns his head toward the orchard. Maybe he heard the dogs. Maybe he heard your landing after all, and only now trusts the sound enough to look for it. You rise just enough to bring the front sight onto the blur of his chest. Your finger takes up the trigger. The pistol does not roar. It gives a dry, contained spit, more mechanical than violent, a cough swallowed in cloth. The man folds where he stands and strikes the dirt with a noise far louder than the shot. You are moving before he finishes falling, across the lane, past the wall, one hand on the pistol, the other reaching for the body, dragging it into the shadow where the hedgerow meets stone. You smell wet wool, mud, tobacco. No alarm, no shout from the farmhouse. The lamp behind the shutter does not brighten. The village stays asleep because the sound that should have woken it never arrived. That was the bargain of the HDM. Not power, not prestige. One life removed from a map without setting the map on fire. Far away from this field, William J. Donovan liked the little pistol enough to show it to President Franklin D. Roosevelt in the Oval Office. Summer of 1944, examples were reaching OSS field stations and entering the same hidden war as the teams dropping into occupied Europe. Not every man who landed carried one, only a few did. But in that black lattice of hedgerows and safe houses, this long, awkward .22 had found its true habitat. By war's end, the government had bought 2,620 of them. Number 11. Welrod Mark II Suppressed Pistol. On June 6, 1944, a three-man Jedburgh team called James jumped into occupied France with Lieutenant Paul A. Kim, Captain Louis T. Le Bailly, and Sergeant Robert Burkhardt. Their job was not to win a battle. Their job was to make it impossible for the Germans to control one. They were there to blow rail lines, link up with the resistance, and delay reinforcements heading toward Normandy. That mission lived in a legal gray zone long before they hit the ground. The 1907 Hague Convention had tried to ban bullets which expand or flatten easily in the human body. Later law would go after silencers in a different way. The instinct was similar. Some tools looked too deliberate, too intimate, too ugly to defend in public. Men like Kim still needed them. Picture what a Jedburgh drop actually meant. 3 men, usually one officer from Britain or America, one from the target country, and one radio operator. A night jump into occupied countryside. Containers scattered across hedgerows, orchards, and flooded fields. A radio set that could get you killed if you stayed on the air too long. Local contacts who might be patriots, opportunists, or informers. And somewhere in that loadout, if the mission called for it, there was something that barely looked like a pistol. It was 310 millimeters long, 135 millimeters high, and only 32 millimeters wide. A plain black tube. A bolt. Crude sights. A grip that also served as the magazine. Remove the grip, and it looked even less like a handgun. The Welrod Mark II was not really a pistol fitted with a silencer. It was a silencer with a pistol hidden inside it. Odd little machine began a year earlier, in 1943, at Station 9 near Welwyn, one of Britain's secret research centers for special operations. Major Hugh Quentin Allen Reeves was the engineer behind it. He was working on a brutally narrow problem. Not trench fighting, not open combat. One guard at a gate, one collaborator in a room, one sentry on a lane where a normal shot would bring 10 more men running. So he built the weapon around suppression from the first sketch instead of trying to soften the blast afterward. Birmingham's Small Arms and other firms produced it in secrecy. Markings were kept sparse on purpose. Even the names became confusing. The .32 caliber Mark II actually came before the later 9mm Mark I, which is why modern summaries so often get the whole family backward. For men like Kim, that paperwork mattered less than the distance. 8 yards. That was the recommended operational range. Not across a field, across a room, across a farm track. Close enough to see the other man's hands. Close enough to know whether he had heard you. The Welrod Mark II in 7.65mm or .32 ACP was built for that kind of violence. Arm's length, nearly private, the kind that leaves the rest of the village asleep. Kim's war depended on that. Jedburgh Team. James landed in Brittany as the invasion began. Their task was to organize and support French resistance groups behind German lines, especially as the occupiers tried to move troops north toward the beaches. That turned every bridge, rail line, convoy route, and roadside checkpoint into part of the same chain. Remove a sentry quietly, and a line might be cut. Cut the line, and a train might not move. The train did not move, men and armor arrived late to Normandy. One body in a ditch could mean one division delayed on a map. The Welrod sat at the darkest edge of that system. It was not a standard sidearm, not a prestige weapon, not something waved around in photographs. It moved through the hidden channels of SOE and OSS with Jedburgh teams, agents, and resistance cells that needed objects they could pack, drop, hide, use, and make vanish again. One surviving Mark IIA in the U.S. Air Force Museum is traced to wartime Danish resistance use. That provenance says almost everything about the life it was meant for. Occupation Europe, small rooms, secret caches, brief use, long silence. That silence helps explain why the numbers around the Welrod never settle. One museum estimate puts wartime production at about 2,800 pistols. Specialist literature built from serial numbers pushes the total much higher, toward 14,000. The gap is huge. Secrecy explains part of it. Sparse markings explain more. These were never meant to be celebrated like service rifles. They were meant to exist just long enough to do something deniable, then disappear into drawers, attics, resistance bunkers, and evidence rooms. The weapons that worked best were often the hardest to count, because the people who used them had every reason to act as if they had never seen them. For Kim, the only count that mattered was smaller. 3 men in the team, 1 radio, 1 occupied province. Every contact could collapse the whole operation. Jedburgh teams look glamorous in hindsight because parachutes and sabotage make good cinema. The reality was slower and uglier. Waiting in barns, cycling on blacked-out roads, loyal farmers from German agents. Deciding whether a guard could be bribed, bypassed, or removed. The Welrod existed for that last choice. It gave its user a chance to kill without announcing himself to the next valley. That same design became toxic in peacetime. Under U.S. law, the Welrod's integral suppressor falls under the National Firearms Act category covering any silencer. After the 1968 changes, the trap closed tighter. If an NFA weapon was never properly registered, federal law offered no path to register that already unregistered gun after the fact. A tool built for secrecy could age into a legal dead end. The state was not only reacting to what it did, it was reacting to what it represented, a weapon whose best feature was that witnesses might not realize it had been used at all. When people imagine banned guns, they usually picture something loud, excessive, theatrical. The Welrod is the reverse. Tiny by battlefield standards, chambered in .32. Effective inside 8 yards, nearly featureless, almost embarrassing to look at. But that plain tube solved a problem more cleanly than many larger weapons ever could. Governments built it in secret, used it in secret, then wrapped the whole category in law. In the hedgerow war behind D-Day, success often depended on the shot nobody heard. And the Welrod's own paperwork nearly says it outright: for silent killing. Number 10. Colt M9A1 pistol. On the evening of June 5, 1944, First Lieutenant Wallace C. Strobel stood at Greenham Common in full jump gear. His face was blacked out for the night drop. A cardboard 23 hung from his neck. He was the jumpmaster for Chalk 23, E Company, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne. Around 1900 hours, word moved through the company's street that someone important was coming. Some of the men guessed it might be a celebrity. Instead, General Dwight D. Eisenhower walked in. He stopped in front of Strobel. He asked where he was from. Strobel said Michigan. Eisenhower talked briefly about fishing. Then he asked the question the men there had already answered to themselves. Was he ready? Strobel said yes. Eisenhower moved on down the line. The photograph from that visit became one of the most famous images of D-Day. Faces blackened, gear hanging everywhere, a few calm seconds before midnight. And somewhere on Strobel's body, almost certainly, sat a weapon the image does not show. The photograph makes the myth easy. You look at airborne troops loaded for Normandy, and your eye goes to the dramatic hardware. Folding stock carbines, submachine guns, bundles of heavier kit. If the pistol is there at all, it feels like decoration, an officer's badge, a sidearm for the camera, not the fight. Something carried because regulations said so, not because the night depended on it. Start with the numbers. 8.25 inches overall, a 5.03-inch barrel, 7 cartridges in the magazine. About 2.437 pounds empty, roughly 3 pounds loaded. Maximum effective range, 50 meters. Muzzle velocity, 830 feet per second. This was not an assault weapon. A room-sweeping bullet hose, not the kind of firearm people build legends around. The M9A1 was compact, blunt, and short-ranged. It was a close tool for close emergencies. The real question is simple. What problem did it solve at 1 o'clock in the morning over Normandy? Operation Albany sent 6,928 paratroopers of the 101st Airborne across the Channel in 443 C-47 aircraft. Across the broader American airborne assault, 13,348 men from the 101st and 82nd dropped between 0:16 and 0:45 on June 6th. The scale was immense. It also made the landing chaotic. Hundreds of aircraft, night, cloud, flak, tracers, pilots jinking, men leaving doors at bad speeds and bad intervals into a countryside already breaking apart below them. A paratrooper did not enter France standing upright with his favorite weapon neatly in both hands. He entered it under opening shock. You are in the door. Then you are in black air. Then the parachute snaps you so hard that anything not secured becomes a liability. Rifles could be slung. Ammunition bundles could be lowered on lines. Equipment could smash, swing, snag, or vanish into the dark. Then came the landing. In Normandy, that often meant hedges, ditches, flooded ground, fences, orchards, rooftops, and trees instead of a nice open field. Strobel came down in one of those trees, several miles from his assigned drop zone. That matters. The M9A1 was not there to win a set-piece firefight. It was there for the first confused minutes after the drop, when a man might be alone, hurt, hung in harness, or separated from his rifle and his squad. That window, 8.25 inches of steel on your belt, mattered more than a longer weapon that had landed somewhere else. The National World War II Museum holds Strobel's USGIM 1911A1. It notes that as an officer, he was authorized a sidearm, and that this pistol was presumably one of the weapons he carried into Normandy. Presumably, not provably. the provenance is incomplete. If you want a clean courtroom exhibit, you do not have one. If you want the balance of the evidence, it points in one direction. Officer, Jumpmaster, D-Day, Normandy. A sidearm authorized and almost certainly worn. The pistol itself survived in his collection. That is, the shape of a real object moving through a real night, even if the paper trail frays exactly where collectors wish it would not. Then there is the holster. The museum notes it may have been rigor modified with an added lift-the-dot closure. That sounds minor until you picture it. Standard gear was often altered because standard assumptions did not survive airborne use. A flap that was fine on the ground could become a problem under parachute shock. So somebody likely changed the holster to keep the pistol from being torn loose when the body jerked and the harness bit in. That is quiet evidence, but it is better than mythology. Nobody modifies a holster for a weapon he expects to leave untouched for the whole operation. You modify it because losing that weapon in descent would be unacceptable. The M9A1 was small enough to stay on the man and important enough that someone worried about exactly that. Now for the bigger claim. People hear banned gun and expect monstrosity. Expect a weapon outlawed because it was too loud, too fast, too visible to ignore. The M9A1 creates a stranger problem. Not because the pistol itself was some forbidden machine, and not because 7 rounds of .45 made legislators panic, but because this is one of the clearest cases where battlefield usefulness had almost nothing to do with spectacle. Its value was practical, intimate, and easy to miss. It worked best when plans failed. That is also why sidearms get flattened in popular memory. They do not dominate the famous photo. They do not define the grand tactic. They live in the gap between the operation as briefed and the operation as experienced. A rifle is doctrine. A pistol is insurance. Insurance looks unimpressive right up until the second you need it. Strip away the heroic haze. The M9A1 was not a magic talisman from some officer-class romance. It was a 3-pound answer to a very specific airborne fact. Men got scattered. Weapons got separated. Landings went wrong. Distances collapsed. In that environment, 50 meters was plenty. 7 cartridges were not abundance, but they were on your body. On D-Day, on a night when entire sticks came down in the wrong fields, on your body could be the difference between armed and unarmed. Strobel had spoken to Eisenhower just hours before boarding. Then he crossed the channel with thousands of others in one part of the largest airborne assault America had yet attempted. Sometime after midnight, he hit Normandy off target and ended up trapped in a tree, hanging above dark ground with enemy territory all around him. His famous photograph was taken before the jump, when everything was still organized. Pistol belongs to the next image, the one no camera caught. A paratrooper suspended in branches, alone, reaching for the one weapon that had stayed with him. Number 9. M1A1 Carbine with folding stock. On the evening of June 5, 1944, Private Bradford Freeman of Easy Company climbed into C-47 aircraft number 70 with 19 other paratroopers, and one problem no designer could ignore. He was a mortar man. His main burden was not his personal weapon. It was an 18-pound mortar base plate strapped to his chest. The jump came down to simple arithmetic. 1 man, 1 parachute, 1 reserve. Ammunition, harness, field gear, a steel base plate pressing into his body. And still, he had to carry a weapon through the aircraft door and into the dark. Not a full-length rifle, a folding stock M1A1 Carbine. The reason is obvious the second you measure it. Extended, the M1A1 ran 35.75 inches. Fold the wire stock under, and it dropped to 25.75. 10 inches gone. In a weapons manual, that is a specification. In the door of a transport aircraft, it is clearance. 10 fewer inches to snag on a static line. 10 fewer inches to bang into a bulkhead. 10 fewer inches jutting into the reserve chute on your chest. The standard M1 carbine was already compact. The M1A1 cut that dimension again. Airborne troops cared about that more than almost anything else. Weight told the same story. About 5 pounds, 3 ounces unloaded. Compare that not to a pistol, because a pistol solved a different problem, but to the weapons Freeman might otherwise wish he had once daylight came. The Garand hit harder and reached farther. It also demanded more room, more weight, more rifle on a body that was already overloaded. The M1A1 asked for less. Less length, less mass, less trouble getting out of the plane. For airborne troops, especially specialists hauling radios, demolitions, mortar parts, or machine gun components, the carbine was not luxury. It was subtraction. The Army knew exactly who it was for. The M1A1 was standardized in May 1942. Deliveries began in October 1942 to the 82nd and 101st Airborne. Total production reached 140,591, all made by Inland, the General Motors division that built them, until production ended in December 1944. That number tells you what the gun was not. This was not a universal infantry rifle handed to everyone. It was a specialist answer for a specialist problem. A folding stock carbine built for men expected to jump at night, under load, into terrain they had never seen. Now the cartridge. 30 carbine. A 110-grain bullet at about 1,975 feet per second, fed from a 15-round detachable box magazine. The numbers matter. 15 rounds meant more immediate fire than the 7 in a pistol magazine. It also meant faster reloads than working a bolt-action relic or feeding a rifle clip under stress. Nearly 2,000 feet per second meant this was no handgun round with a stock attached. But it also was not .30-06. Not close. The carbine sat in a narrow space between sidearm and battle rifle. Enough gun to fight with. Not enough gun to be mistaken for the heaviest hitter in the hedgerows. That trade looked smart inside the aircraft. It looked less clean over Normandy. Freeman's C-47 took flak crossing the channel. The red light came on, then the green. But the plane was moving at about 200 miles per hour, roughly 100 miles per hour faster than normal jump speed. That number changes the whole jump. Twice the drag when you hit the slipstream. It's time to think. Less control in the exit. Men were not stepping calmly into black sky, they were being thrown into it. In that condition, a compact weapon mattered more than almost anything else. Combat came later. First, you had to survive the jump. Freeman landed in a pasture. For a moment, the cows in the dark looked like home in Mississippi. Then he was back in France, working through the dark with a weapon and gear still on him. He found a friend with a broken leg and kept moving. By daylight, he had joined a mixed group under Lieutenant Richard Winters near Brecourt Manor. There, the M1A1's equations started to fail him. Normandy was not one battlefield. It was dozens of tiny ones stitched together by hedgerows. One moment you were inside close cover, where a light weapon with 15 rounds and fast handling made immediate sense. Then a field opened, and the distance stretched. The target was no longer across a lane or inside a doorway. It was farther out, partly screened, maybe shooting back from behind earth and brush. Freeman later picked up an M1 Garand because he felt the carbine would not shoot far enough. That is the important detail. Not that the gun jammed. Not that it was useless. It would not shoot far enough. The evidence points in two directions at once. A 25.75-inch folded carbine is easier to jump with than a full battle rifle. A 5-pound weapon is easier to carry when you already have 18 pounds of mortar plate on your chest. A 15-round magazine is generous compared with a sidearm. A 110-grain bullet at 1,975 feet per second is enough for real fighting. But range is not an abstract statistic. It's whether the weapon still feels adequate when the terrain suddenly stops being intimate. Freeman still called it a good street fighter. That was a field measurement. Good when the fight collapses inward, less convincing when the map opens. That is the most honest thing about the M1A1 on D-Day. It was not the better rifle. It was the better compromise. Airborne units did not need every man carrying the theoretically strongest shoulder weapon at all times. They needed men to get out of the aircraft, hit the ground armed, regroup, and move. The M1A1 solved the first half of that problem brilliantly. The moment the jump was over, the second half began. The same compactness that made it ideal in the door could make it feel limited in the field. Decades later, that same gun slipped easily into banned gun language, not because of what Freeman experienced at Brécourt, not because lawmakers were running ballistic tables on a 110-grain bullet. The visible hardware did the work. Semi-automatic rifle, detachable magazine, folding stock, pistol grip. Under the 1994 federal feature test, combinations like that pushed a rifle into the assault weapon category. California's later definitions separately singled out the same furniture on semi-automatic centerfire rifles without fixed magazines. The parts that made the M1A1 practical for a paratrooper in a C-47 became, decades later, the parts most likely to trigger prohibition. The contrast is plain in the numbers. Officially, the folding stock carbine looked suspicious because it was compact. D-Day, it was compact because men like Bradford Freeman were jumping at night with 18 pounds of crew-served equipment strapped to their bodies, out of a plane doing 200 miles per hour, into fields where even landing armed was not guaranteed. In Normandy, the stock was the solution. The limit was farther out, across the field. Number 8. Sten Mark V submachine gun. On May 19, 1986 in the United States, the legal future of one very simple wartime submachine gun split in two. Anything already registered as a civilian transferable machine gun stayed in the system. Anything made after that cutoff did not. A live, full-auto Sten, a weapon originally stamped out for men expected to disappear into darkness with it, became, decades later, the kind of object most people would only ever see behind glass, in a museum rack, or on a short line in federal law. That sounds obvious now. Run the clock backward and the ban lands on something stranger than the word machine gun suggests. It lands on a 9mm tube gun with a wooden butt, a side-mounted 32-round magazine, and just enough refinement to make it feel almost civilized. If that sounds too mild to fear, Normandy corrects the picture. Just after midnight on June 6, 1944, the Sten Mark V enters D-Day not on a beach, but on a bridge. 6 British Horsa gliders came in toward the Caen Canal and Orne River crossings near Bénouville and Ranville. Major John Howard's coup de main force had one job: take the bridges intact before the Germans could blow them. No long firefight, no second attempt. Hit the ground, hit the objective, and finish it before the defenders understood what was happening. The first gliders landed within roughly 50 meters of Pegasus Bridge. 50. In darkness. In silence right up until impact. Then the quiet ended. Men spilled out through smashed glider noses into dust, smoke, shouted orders, and the metallic chopping sound of close-range automatic fire. Sten Mark V makes sense here. Not in an armory chart or laid out on a table beside cleaner-looking guns. In the first violent minute after landing, a weapon had to come up fast, clear corners, and keep working at ranges measured in yards, not fields. Lieutenant Herbert Den Brotheridge was 28 years old. He led his platoon of D Company, 2nd Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, across the bridge. One source specifically identifies him as carrying a 9mm Sten Mark V when German fire hit him near the center of the span, shortly after 0016 to 0020. The bridge was taken intact within minutes. Brotheridge is often remembered as the first Allied officer killed by enemy action on D-Day. Stay in the scene for a second. A narrow bridge in the dark, steel railings on either side, tracers coming back at you. The gun in your hands is 76.2 centimeters long, not a full rifle. Loaded, it weighs 4.07 kilograms. Not feather light, but compact enough to move with. The magazine hangs off the side with 32 rounds of 9x19 millimeters. At this distance, that is no compromise. It is the weapon doing exactly what it was built to do. The Mark V was the polished Sten. That only makes sense if you remember what the ordinary Sten looked like. Crude, cheap, functional in the least flattering possible way. The Mark V kept the same brutal principle: blowback action, open bolt, stamped simplicity, but added details that suggest somebody finally admitted a soldier would have to aim the thing. Wooden buttstock, better sights, a bayonet lug, because British planners never entirely stopped imagining close-quarter fighting getting even closer. There was even a wooden front grip on early examples. Theory, an upgrade. In practice, a weak point, prone to loosening or breakage under stress, and later removed. Very Sten. Improve one thing, then discover the improvement has problems of its own. For airborne troops, the important part was not elegance, it was geometry. A British or Canadian paratrooper could jump with 7 magazines for a Sten. If all 7 were full, that was 224 rounds of 9mm. Beside rifle ammunition, that may not sound dramatic. In a night drop, it sounded different. 224 rounds in compact magazines, feeding a gun that did not ask much space of you in a glider or in a parachute harness, but could throw a burst the instant you regrouped. The first airborne problem was always the same: not winning the battle in theory, but arriving with enough immediate violence to survive the first few minutes. Another advantage appears when you picture men isolated after a jump. The Sten was chambered in 9 by 19mm, so were German submachine guns and pistols. If a British airborne force got cut off, scattered, or forced to fight on whatever it could gather, captured enemy ammunition was not useless metal. It could feed the Sten. Not glamorous, not the sort of detail that appears in heroic paintings. Exactly the kind of detail men notice when supply lines are gone, containers landed in the wrong field, and dawn is still hours away. For a paratrooper, that common cartridge was insurance. By June 7th, photographs show British 6th Airborne men near Ronville with Mark V Stens, Horsa gliders still visible behind them. That image fixes the gun where it belonged, not as a gangster prop, but as a generic machine gun, as a battlefield tool for men who had come in by night and were now holding ground in daylight. The wood furniture almost softens it in photographs. Almost. The side magazine still juts out like an exposed mechanism. The tube receiver still looks improvised. The whole thing still carries the visual offense that later law tends to notice first. Compact, magazine-fed, controllable in bursts, obviously military. Take the cold possibility that the legal instinct is backward and the consequences become plain. The weapons that worked best in the hardest, closest, most chaotic conditions were often the ones that looked least respectable once the war was over. The Sten Mark V fits that pattern perfectly. Crude, but refined just enough for a man sprinting off a glider into a bridge seizure. Ugly, but useful in the exact way airborne operations demanded. The later state did not remember the bridge. It remembered the category. Categories flatten everything. They flatten the difference between a Sten in an evidence locker and a Sten in Brotheridge's hands on Pegasus Bridge. They flatten the fact that one source names a Mark V specifically, while many accounts simply say Sten, because paperwork and memory rarely preserve combat down to the exact variant in the exact second. They flatten the reason this gun existed at all, not to impress, not to endure on a parade ground, but to get out of an aircraft, cross a deadly piece of infrastructure, and win a fight measured in minutes. The folding stock carbine was about arriving armed. The Sten Mark V is about what happens immediately after. You have landed. You have found your objective. The range collapses, the noise spikes, and every virtue turns physical. Length, weight, magazine capacity, recoil, the speed of the first burst. On a bridge after midnight, those are not features. They are survival. Survival leaves odd fossils. Decades later, the transferable live Stens that remain in American civilian hands are finite because the registry closed on that 1986 line. The gun that once spread through wartime production because it was simple to make became scarce because law stopped time around it. So the Mark V survives in 2 incompatible images at once: a practical airborne weapon of June 1944 and a tightly constrained legal artifact of the late 20th century. At Pegasus Bridge, It was a compact answer to a brutally specific problem. Years later, it became a compact object people were taught to fear on sight. A wooden-stocked Sten lies in dark grass beside a bridge. The canal water keeps moving past it. Number 7. Sten M1A1 suppressed submachine gun. On the night of June 5th to 6th, 1944, Captain Pierre Marienne dropped into Brittany with 17 men. His mission looks tiny beside Normandy. No beaches, no bridge assault, no armada. Just a Free French SAS advance party landing near Plumelec ahead of Colonel Pierre-Louis Bourgoin's larger 160-man Operation Dingson force. Their job was to pin German units in the interior before those units could move toward the storm in Normandy. The records give you the operation, the names, the drop zone, the objective, and Sten guns in this SAS world. But when you look for the suppressed Sten Mark II IS, the trail goes quiet. That gap matters. The Mark II IS fits a mission built on darkness, isolation, and 1 or 2 men moving ahead of everyone else. Not a standard airborne room broom like the louder Sten Mark V at Pegasus Bridge. Not a gun for charging a bridge in the first minute after landing. This was something else. It was requested in 1942, trialed in November that year, and entered production in February 1944. It arrived just in time for Overlord-era special operations. Only 5,776 were made. At the same moment the Allied airborne war reached huge scale, 6,928 men from the U.S. 101st Airborne in Mission Albany alone, this gun sat at the opposite end of the spectrum. Scarce, secretive, and built for work that barely left witnesses. The clearest evidence is not a jump photo. It is the gun itself. Museum examples in collections like the National Army Museum and the Australian War Memorial preserve the contradiction in steel. Start with the barrel, 3.75 inches. Then the 6 vent holes cut into it. Then the suppressor around the front, roughly 12 inches long, filled with 18 baffles. A normal submachine gun uses expanding gas to stay violent. This one bleeds that gas off early. It slows the 9mm ammunition. It traps the blast long enough to knock the report down from a crack to something close to a cough. The sound was only half of it. The other half barely fits the name submachine gun. The Sten Mark II IS was still selective fire on paper. In practice, doctrine pushed hard the other way. Single shots were the point. Full auto was for emergencies. If you ran it like an ordinary Sten, the heat and pressure could damage the suppressor system. So the cheap, stamped gun Britain mass-produced for wartime simplicity turned into a specialist's instrument. You had to handle it with care. A machine gun you were warned not to use as a machine gun. That tension sits inside the Brittany record. The mission rewarded silence. Free French SAS were operating behind the lines, linking with resistance, preparing sabotage, and trying to survive in countryside that turned lethal by daylight. The suppressed Sten was already in production by February 1944 for exactly this kind of clandestine work. But the surviving sources never give the clean sentence every historian wants. Captain so-and-so jumped on D-Day carrying a Sten Mark II IS, serial number this, drop zone that. They confirm the world the weapon belonged to. They do not pin it to a named jumper in the act. This is how combat paperwork hides things. A loud gun gets remembered because everyone hears it. A standard gun gets named because everyone knows what it is. A niche variant in a night drop behind the lines can disappear into the word Sten and stay there. One account says Sten. Another says submachine gun. Another remembers only that the team was armed. That flattening started immediately. Men landing in the dark were not writing collector-grade catalogs. It happened again later because memory keeps action better than variance. It happened a third time in public history because Pegasus Bridge and Utah Beach pulled attention away from the quieter airborne war in Brittany. Picture the first hour after landing. Hedgerows, dark fields, men trying to make contact with the resistance. patrols somewhere beyond the next line of brush, maybe one sentry between you and the next safe move. By daylight, that countryside could kill you. Before dawn, noise mattered more than range. In that world, a burst was too much. A muzzle flash was too much. Even success could be too loud. The ideal weapon was not the most powerful one. It was the one that let violence happen without telling the next farm where it came from. The MKIIS answers the larger question running under this story. It worked because it erased the normal signature of a firearm. It killed, and it concealed the shot. Armies notice that. Bureaucracies do too. Later, in the United States, the legal afterlife of this design became a double lock: machine gun and silencer under the National Firearms Act, then the May 19, 1986 registry cutoff that froze newly made civilian transferable machine guns out of reach. A weapon built for secret wartime use became almost unsayable in ordinary civilian terms. In June 1944, none of that mattered. What mattered was whether a man in the dark could fire once, maybe twice, and keep the countryside asleep. The ordinary airborne Sten story is easy to prove. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge at Pegasus Bridge had a Mark V in his hands. Loud fight, famous objective, clear memory. The Mark II's left a different footprint, half in production records, half in doctrine, half in the negative space of reports too vague to satisfy anyone. Too many halves. That is the point. Weapons made for covert work rarely survive as clean stories. So no, this was not the classic D-Day paratrooper gun. It sat next to that story, in the dark, just beyond the big photographs. It belongs more naturally to SAS patrols, SOE logic, resistance link-ups, and the lonely math of one quiet shot before dawn. Full auto could break it. Number 6. M3 Grease Gun. June 6, 1944. You're in the door of a C-47 somewhere over Normandy. It is between 1:30 and 2:30 in the morning. You are about 600 feet up. That is no height at all when Silk opens late and Tracer starts coming back. There is no time to admire engineering, no time to compare catalogs. You jump with what fits, what clears the fuselage, what will not snag, what you can drag through a hedgerow 5 minutes after landing. For a few American paratroopers that night, that weapon was not the famous Thompson. It was a squat little .45 with a wire stock, a stamped body, and the look of something a mechanic forgot under a workbench. The M3 Grease Gun had made it to Normandy. Barely. But it was there. It was built to solve a problem, fast. In late 1942, the U.S. Army wanted a submachine gun factories could turn out faster and cheaper than the Thompson. The Thompson worked. Everybody knew it worked. But it was heavy, expensive, and full of machining time the wartime clock did not want to pay for. George Hyde's T-20 prototype went into testing at Aberdeen. Airborne Command examined it. Armored Forces did too. For both, the reason was simple: space. A short .45 with a folding stock made sense when your war began by dropping out of an airplane or climbing out of a tank. On January 11, 1943, the Army approved it, and Guide Lamp, a General Motors division in Anderson, Indiana, got the big contract: 300,000 guns. It sounded straightforward: stamp steel, weld it, ship it. But war production likes to make fools of clean plans. By July 1943, the goal was 20,000 guns. Actual output was about 900. 900, not 20,000. Cheap gun was hard to build at scale. Still, the design kept pulling people back. Pick it up and the logic is obvious: 8 pounds without the magazine. Add a full 30-round box of .45 ball, and you add another 2.10 pounds. It fires slowly for a submachine gun, around 350 to 450 rounds per minute, with a muzzle velocity of about 920 feet per second. In plain English, it does not chew through ammunition the way a Thompson can. It lumbers, chugs, pushes. In close country, that can be a gift. Short bursts are easier. Control is easier. Carrying it through a hatch or a hedgerow is easier. Picture the first hour after the drop. You are scattered, maybe alone, maybe with 3 men from the wrong stick and 1 from the right regiment. Your equipment hangs off you in awkward lumps. Every fence line is a threat. Every orchard feels occupied. Airborne doctrine has collapsed into mud, ditches, and whatever gun is actually in your hands. In that moment, a compact .45 that folds down small starts to look very smart. But the M3 came with a nasty catch. The early gun used a side cocking handle, fine on a range, fine in inspection, less fine when a weapon lands hard, bangs into a door frame, gets crushed under a body, or slams against French ground in the dark. That handle could break. If it broke at the wrong moment, your beautifully simple stamped gun stopped being simple. It became dead weight. The same simplicity that attracted airborne command also created the risk in airborne use. The whole concept was to strip the submachine gun down to essentials: welded receiver, collapsible wire stock, blowback action, 30 rounds of .45, cheap enough to flood the war with it. Eventually, that happened. By the end, the United States had built 606,694 M3s and another 15,469 improved M9A1s. Huge numbers. On D-Day, though, the weapon was still in its awkward stage. New enough to be unusual, useful enough to matter, flawed enough to bite the men carrying it. The grease gun sits in an odd corner of this story. It was never the standard image of the American paratrooper. That picture still belongs to the folding stock carbine, the Thompson, the rifle, the pistol. Try to pin a famous name D-Day jumper to an M3 with courtroom certainty, and the trail gets slippery fast. The strongest evidence says some men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne carried them in the Normandy drop. That is solid. But this gun lives at the edge of the big photographs. You find it in production records, procurement logic, board evaluations, scattered references. It slips into history sideways. That suits the weapon. The M3 came out of impatience, not romance or prestige. The Army already had a glamorous submachine gun. It wanted one that could be stamped faster. One that ordinary industrial America could crank out without treating every receiver like a piece of jewelry. That is a different way of making war. Less legend, more throughput. Bureaucracies could admire that on paper. Troops judged it somewhere else. When people sneer at the grease gun as a cheap stopgap, they miss what it was actually for. Cheap was the point. Compact was the point. Airborne interest was real. Armored interest was real. This was not junk accidentally shoved onto specialist troops. It was a deliberate answer to a specialist problem. How do you give a man jumping from an aircraft or trapped in a steel box a .45 caliber automatic weapon that does not take up half his life to carry? In that sense, the ugly little tube did what it was asked to do. Weapons like this leave an uncomfortable fact behind them. The guns that worked best were often the ones people later tried hardest to ban or bury. Worked best does not always mean noble, handsome, or beloved. Sometimes it means brutally practical, easy to mass produce, easy to hide in a vehicle, easy to jump with, easy to hand to men whose war begins in chaos. That kind of efficiency makes people nervous. The Army noticed the M3's weakness soon enough. On December 21, 1944, the improved M9A1 was standardized. One of the smartest changes was also the simplest. The fragile side-cocking handle was gone. Instead, the shooter could retract the bolt using a finger recess. Cruder in some ways. Better in the way that mattered. One less piece waiting to snap when the world hit it hard. So the D-Day grease gun belongs to a brief, dangerous window, before the fix, before the cleaned-up version, when the concept was right, but the details were still trying to kill confidence in it. So if you picture the M3 in Normandy, do not picture triumph. Picture a compact weapon built for cramped spaces and rough war, finally reaching the troops it suited best, then arriving with a flaw the drop itself could expose. That is the early grease gun in one image. Useful, smart, efficient, and one bad impact away from betrayal. Official manual would later describe it with dead calm. Submachine gun, caliber .45, M3. The men who jumped with it got something messier. Number 5. Thompson M1A1 submachine gun. On June 6, 1944, somewhere inland from Utah Beach, Second Lieutenant Lynn "Buck" Compton came down into Normandy without the weapon he was supposed to fight with. Operation Albany had dropped 6,928 men of the 101st Airborne into the dark, into low cloud, into flak, into fields cut by hedges and ditches. When Compton hit the ground near an orchard, his leg bag was gone. So was his own gun. The jump is over. The war on the ground has already started. He is standing there with no primary weapon in his hands. He cuts himself loose and starts moving anyway. The morning works like that. Not by map, not by clean formation, by sound, by flashes, by whoever you can gather in the dark. The beach is somewhere ahead, hidden but unmistakable, a long rolling concussion under the night. Men are landing all over the Norman countryside, but not where they were meant to. They were supposed to arrive as units. Instead, they arrive as fragments. Compton moves through trees and orchard rows with a small group, trying to pull some shape out of the scatter. Then they find another lieutenant. The man is down with a broken leg. He is not going anywhere. But he still has what Compton needs, a Thompson and 2 grenades. Compton takes them and keeps moving. The gun in his hands is almost certainly an M1A1 Thompson, the wartime version airborne troops mostly carried in Normandy. Not the old gangster picture Thompson with the fat drum magazine and polished legend attached to it. This one is simpler, meaner, built for war and built in quantity. Adopted in October 1942 after the M1 had been standardized in April that year, it stripped out the earlier Blish lock, shifted the charging handle to the right side, dropped drum compatibility, and fed from a straight 30-round box. In your hands, it weighs 5.31 kilograms loaded for combat. It throws .45 ACP at about 280 meters per second. Hold the trigger, and it can run to roughly 700 rounds a minute. In the hedgerows, in a trench, across a farm lane, that means immediate authority. This is the kind of country it was made for. Compton moves toward Brecourt Manor, toward the sound of firing from the direction of the beach exits. Dawn is still thin. The ground is close and wet. Hedges break the fields into little rooms. Visibility comes in slices. A weapon like the Thompson makes sense here in a way a full-length rifle does not. Short barrel, big bullet, fast burst. A gun for sudden shapes at short range, for men appearing over a bank or around a stone wall with no warning at all. The kind of weapon armies choose when fighting gets compressed down to 20 yards and 1 breath. He keeps walking into it. Near the German battery at Brecourt, he sees them. 2 Germans. They are working a howitzer aimed toward the exits off Utah Beach, where the invasion is still trying to force itself inland. The scene tightens at once. The orchard and the night and the scattered drop collapse into one clear target. 2 men at a gun, a borrowed Thompson. Distance short enough that this should be simple. Compton brings the weapon up at hip level. That detail matters because this is not a range. This is not a textbook stance. This is close work in a half-lit field where speed matters more than posture. The Thompson was famous for exactly this kind of ugly practicality. A heavy submachine gun, yes, but compact enough for airborne chaos and vicious enough at close range to settle a problem in one hard burst. More than 539,000 M1A1s would be produced before wartime manufacture ended in 1944. By then, the gun was less a symbol than a tool. A simplified machine stamped out because men kept needing something short, rough, and decisive. Compton sights on the Germans and squeezes the trigger. Nothing. No burst, no recoil, no metallic hammering through the morning, just dead weight in his hands. For a fraction of a second, the whole weapon changes character. A moment ago, it was 30 rounds of .45 in a package built for trenches and farm lanes. Now, it is 5 kilos of useless steel and wood. The firing pin had broken in the jump. One violent parachute landing, one hard impact somewhere between aircraft and orchard, and the gun that was supposed to solve the next 10 seconds had already failed before the first shot. Bill Guarnier is just behind him. Guarnier does not wait. He fires and drops one of the Germans. Compton still has the second. But the Thompson has already told him what it is worth. He does not baby it. He does not fumble with it. He goes to the other thing he took from the wounded lieutenant. A grenade. The sequence is almost too fast to hold. The useless submachine gun slung in the instant between trust and anger. The grenade in the hand. The throw. The blast in the gun position. Men on D-Day did not get long to absorb betrayal from their equipment. Adjusted inside the same breath, or they died with the problem still in their hands. That is what makes the Thompson in this field such a sharp image. It is not rare. It is not experimental. It is not some oddity the Army barely understood. By June 1944, the M1A1 Thompson was a mature wartime answer, the streamlined descendant of a famous gun, trimmed for mass production and combat use, exactly the sort of weapon you would hand to airborne troops expected to land scattered and fight at once. Short enough for hedgerows, powerful enough for shock, simple enough to survive rough handling. Then Normandy hits it once, hard, and it is done. Compton is near an enemy battery with a dead gun in his grip, one German already down, another just hit by the grenade, and the beach fight still thundering ahead through the morning haze. Around him, the scattered landing is beginning to harden into something more dangerous and more deliberate. Men are finding each other. Targets are becoming clearer. In his hands, the legendary Thompson is already finished. Number 4. M1 Garand Rifle. On June 6, 1944, Private First Class John Steele was hanging from the church tower in Sainte-Mère-Église with an M1 Garand he could not use. The drop began shortly after midnight, inside the larger airborne assault that sent more than 13,000 American paratroopers over the Cotentin Peninsula between 016 and 0245. Steele's war did not begin with a clean jump into a dark pasture. It began over a town already lit by fire. Tracers climbed into the sky. Men drifted straight into them. He was hit in the foot. His parachute snagged on the church. He ended up suspended above the square, wounded, exposed, and forced to play dead while German soldiers moved below him. The image stays with people because it is so hard to shake. A paratrooper dangling over one of the first towns touched by the invasion. It also says something brutal about the weapon he carried. The standard rifle of the U.S. Army in 1944 was the M1 Garand, adopted in 1936. A 43.6-inch semi-automatic rifle weighing about 9.5 pounds unloaded, fed by an 8-round N-block clip of .30-06. For an infantryman advancing on foot, that was formidable. For a man dropping through darkness in a T5 parachute harness loaded with reserve chute, leg bag, ammunition, knife, canteen, and gear, it became a different kind of problem. Not weak, long, awkward, unforgiving. Airborne doctrine tried to fix the jump first. Many paratroopers packed the Garand in a quilted canvas Griswold bag, officially the Container Individual Aerial Delivery Rifle, clipped to the harness before takeoff. Late spring 1942 had produced a neat answer to an ugly problem. Instead of driving a full-length rifle into your legs on descent or snagging it on exit, you broke it down, sealed it in canvas, and trusted that after landing you would have time to turn it back into a rifle. Steel is where that neat answer starts to fail. Picture the square. You are hanging above Sainte-Mère-Église in the first hour of D-Day. Your right foot is wounded. Your hands are occupied with staying alive. Your rifle, if it went down bagged, as many did, is not a rifle in the only sense that matters. It is wood and steel trapped inside procedure. Somewhere below you, or beside you, or lost in the chaos of the landing, there is canvas, a steel closure rod, and several motions standing between you and your first shot. The Garand still promises 8 rounds of fast, semi-automatic fire. It still offers reach and authority. But promise is not readiness, and Normandy exposed that difference at once. That was the airborne Garand's problem. Once assembled, it gave a paratrooper far more than a pistol and more reach than a submachine gun in the dark lanes and hedgerows behind Utah Beach. The M1923 cartridge belt carried 10 pockets for 10 clips, 80 rounds on the belt before bandoliers and extra pockets stuffed wherever they would fit. A man who got his Garand working had serious firepower by airborne standards. But the first seconds on French soil could disappear into mechanics. Get out of the chute, find the bag, yank the steel rod, reassemble the rifle, seat the 8-round clip, then move. The weapon meant to make you dangerous could require you to stand still first. Steel, because his drop went so badly wrong, shows that weakness in its clearest form. Did not land, crouch, unzip canvas, and calmly build his rifle back into existence. He became part of the church tower. German troops were in the square. Other paratroopers were being shot in the streets. He survived by not moving, not fighting, not reaching for some heroic burst of return fire. The most famous American airborne image of that night is not a man firing his rifle. It is a man who cannot bring one to bear. The Garand was not some specialist's oddity. It was the ordinary rifle placed inside an extraordinary delivery system. The National Museum of the U.S. Air Force notes that most D-Day paratroopers carried the standard M1 Garand, though some carried carbines or submachine guns. The men dropped behind the beaches were often carrying exactly the same rifle as line infantry. Line infantry did not have to descend into flooded fields and burning towns, cut themselves free of silk and shroud lines, and rebuild their main weapon under threat. Airborne troops did. A rifle that worked beautifully once the fight settled could be at its worst in the one moment that decided whether you got to join the fight at all. Some men chose to jump with their weapons already assembled. The bag made descent safer, but made landing more dangerous. The assembled rifle made descent more dangerous, but might save your life the instant your boots hit French soil. We do not have a clean number for how many Normandy paratroopers made that choice. The darkness, the flak, and the fear forced men to improvise around the danger they trusted least. Steele's story did not end on the church. Soldiers eventually cut him down and captured him, taking him for dead or helpless until he could be processed with other prisoners. Later he escaped and rejoined American forces. His night shows more than legend. Airborne combat did not start with the first exchange of fire. It started in the hard interval before a weapon was even ready. With a Thompson, the betrayal came when a gun failed in the middle of action. With the Garand, the danger could arrive before action started, in the dead time between landing and loading. The rifle also looks different once you step outside Normandy and into later categories. The M1 Garand is semi-automatic, but because it feeds from a fixed internal magazine loaded by an 8-round en-bloc clip, it often sits outside later legal definitions aimed at detachable magazine rifles. In official language, that can make it seem tame, old, almost exempt from the categories that catch newer guns. In Sainte-Mère-Église that night, none of that meant anything. If an American got his Garand together, he had a fast-firing .30-06 battle rifle in his hands. Normandy leaves a hard contrast behind. Officially, the M1 Garand was the standard rifle, ordinary enough to be issued by the million and plain enough to dodge some labels later attached to semi-automatics. On the ground, in the first minutes of D-Day, it could be a canvas-wrapped burden that left a paratrooper helpless until he turned it back into a weapon. For those first terrible seconds, the rifle was there and still out of reach. Number 3. M9A1 Browning Automatic Rifle. On June 6, 1944, near Amfreville in Normandy, Private First Class Thomas Lloyd Rogers found American paratroopers pinned under German machine gun and small arms fire. His Distinguished Service Cross citation says he climbed onto a stone wall, exposed himself to that fire, and answered with a Browning automatic rifle. Not a light little carbine, not a handy folding gun. ABAR. Nearly 48 inches long, roughly 20 pounds with bipod and loaded magazine. The kind of weapon that sounds absurd on a night parachute drop until it is the only thing on hand that can break a position open. Rogers used it to silence the gun. Then he kept moving and drove Germans back with automatic fire. The citation credits him with killing or wounding 25 enemy soldiers. He survived that fight. He was dead 9 days later, on June 15th. People like to say the BAR was too big, too heavy, too awkward to belong in airborne combat. The record points in a harsher direction. It did not belong there. Once it was on the ground, men still did not want to be without it. Start with the label, because the label hides what the weapon actually was. Browning Automatic Rifle. The name makes people picture a heavier infantry rifle, something that can fire careful single shots and switch to bursts when needed. The M1918A2 was not that. The A2 version removed semi-automatic fire entirely. Its selector gave the gunner two choices: slow automatic, around 300 to 350 rounds per minute, or fast automatic, around 500 to 600. This was not a rifle with extra options. It was a machine gun carrying a rifle's name. Then the feed. 20 rounds in a detachable box magazine, not 30, not 40. In .30 caliber with ball, armor-piercing, or tracer depending on the load. The BAR hit with full-power rifle ammunition, but a full magazine did not last long. At the fast rate, it could vanish in about 2 seconds. At the slow rate, the gunner got more control, not more abundance. The power was real. So was the appetite. Then the weight. Ordnance listed the M1918A2 at 19.4 pounds with bipod and magazine. Remove the bipod and it dropped to 17. By one standard, that is a light machine gun. By another, it is a monstrous parachute rifle. Add the ammunition load a BAR man was expected to carry: 12 magazines in belt pouches and 1 in the weapon, 260 rounds total. Then picture a night jump over Normandy. Flak in the air, hedgerows below, a weapon almost 4 feet long hanging on a man whose doctrine wishes it were easier to carry. That is where the myth really begins. People hear banned gun and expect some sinister mechanism, some forbidden trick hidden in the metal. With the BAR, the first case against it was practical. It was too long to manage cleanly, too heavy to land with comfortably, too hungry for magazines to forgive carelessness. In airborne terms, nobody was confused about its tactical value. The insult was logistical. Strip the story down like a detective. What did the BAR do that made men keep dragging it into places it did not fit? Immediate, automatic fire. A scattered airborne unit does not always have time to assemble a neat firing line. Men land off target, officers disappear, radio plans die in hedges and ditches. One man with a BAR can put a stream of .30-06 into a machine gun nest right now. Not after the platoon sorts itself out. After heavier support comes up. Right now. Range and punch. A submachine gun could spray fast, but pistol ammunition had limits once the shooting reached into cover, across fields, or against dug-in positions. The BAR fired the same cartridge family that made full-size battle rifles feared. Normandy was not fought in clean hallways. It was fought across stone walls, through orchards, into farmyards, and against positions that had to be beaten, not just frightened. Rogers himself is the clearest example. His citation does not show a man carefully employing a doctrinal support weapon from a perfect prone position with all his ammunition stacked neatly beside him. It shows a paratrooper climbing onto a stone wall under fire. It shows him using the BAR hard enough to silence a machine gun and push Germans back. That is not textbook elegance. It is field evidence. The weapon was a burden on the jump. On the ground, it gave a scattered force something close to instant local superiority. That is the contradiction at the center of the BAR. Airborne conditions punished weight and bulk. After landing, those same conditions made a gun like this more valuable. In the aircraft, you wanted compactness. In the hedgerow, you wanted hitting power. Those demands did not match. So the BAR kept ending up in the same category as other effective weapons in this story. Officially awkward, tactically cherished. There is one more wrinkle. Rogers' citation identifies him as Company C, 1st Battalion, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, and says he jumped into Normandy. Some unit histories say the 504th was withheld from the Normandy jump after Anzio, aside from possible detached volunteers or pathfinders. The paperwork leaves a seam. Was Rogers attached elsewhere? Was the citation imprecise? Was he part of a small detached group? The action itself was real enough to earn a Distinguished Service Cross. The exact unit path still needs archival confirmation. That uncertainty suits the weapon. Even in the paperwork, the BAR appears in Normandy as something slightly out of place and impossible to ignore. Outside wartime language, the classification gets even sharper. In modern U.S. legal terms, the BAR is a machine gun. Federal law generally bars civilian transfer or possession of machine guns except for government use or those lawfully possessed before May 19, 1986. The old confusion disappears there. The law looks at the M1918A2's selector, sees slow auto and fast auto with no semi-automatic mode, and drops any sentimental attachment to the word rifle. The forensic answer is colder than the legend. The dramatic version says the BAR was some super rifle too deadly for polite society. The record says something plainer. Its later legal stigma came from what it was mechanically. Its wartime problem came from what it was physically. A machine gun by function, a burden by length, a gift in a firefight. Armies kept trying to organize around that contradiction because the weapon forced it on them. Near Amfleville, Rogers climbed a wall with one anyway. In the dark, with 20 rounds at a time and a gun almost as long as he was tall from the hip up, he turned a pinned group back into an advancing one. 9 days later, he was dead. R stayed what it had been on D-Day, too cumbersome to feel reasonable, too useful to leave behind. In photographs, it lies across the arms like just another long gun. In a field after the jump, with magazines running dry and hedgerows swallowing sound, it is something else. A heavy automatic shape speaking in bursts, then going quiet. Number 2. Winchester Model 12 Trench Shotgun. On September 19, 1918, a protest reached the desk of the U.S. Secretary of State. Germany cited Article 23E of the 1907 Hague Regulations, the clause against weapons calculated to cause unnecessary suffering, and threatened execution for any American prisoner captured carrying a shotgun or even shotgun ammunition. Not artillery, not gas, a shotgun. In 1918, the main target was the Winchester Model 1897. When the United States went back to war in 1941, the reputation was still there, and the weapon that inherited it was the Winchester Model 12. Start with the profile. 12 gauge, pump action, 5 rounds in the tubular magazine, 1 more in the chamber if you had time to load it there. 6 shots before the gun went empty. On one unaltered 1943 trench gun specimen, the barrel measures 20 7/8 inches. Over that barrel sat the part everybody remembers, a perforated steel handguard to save your hand from heat. And at the front, a bayonet adapter that turned a compact fighting shotgun into something halfway between a hallway weapon and a short spear. There was no hammer outside the receiver. The Model 12 was hammerless, cleaner in outline than the old 1897, but the legal ghost attached to it was older than the steel. Then the production trail. From 1941 to 1944, Winchester turned out World War II trench guns in serious numbers. One commonly cited total, from Canfield by way of later firearms research, is 61,104 Model 12 12-gauge shotguns delivered to the U.S. government. Another figure appears again and again, about 80,000 procured or manufactured in wartime. The gap matters. It shows what this weapon became in memory. Even the count blurs at the edges. But either number puts it far beyond novelty. This was not an oddball purchase. This was an issued weapon with U.S. ordnance proofs bought by the tens of thousands because somebody expected close-range fighting often enough to justify it. Close range is the whole case for a trench shotgun. A Garand gives you reach. A carbine gives you lighter weight. A Thompson gives you bursts. A 12-gauge loaded with buckshot solves a different problem. A target inside a few yards, half seen, moving now, maybe through brush, maybe through a doorway, maybe in rain, maybe while you are guarding prisoners and do not have space for elegant marksmanship. That is where the Model 12 built its wartime record. Pacific jungle, guard posts, ship security, prisoner control. Later Korea, later Vietnam. Places where the fight collapsed from fields into feet. Now set that beside Normandy. Between 016 and 245 on June 6, 1944, 13,348 U.S. paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne came down over the Cotentin Peninsula. You can count the aircraft. You can count the sticks. You can count the men. When you look at the weapons planned for that drop, the pattern is blunt. M1 rifles packed in Griswold bags, M1A1 folding stock carbines, Thompsons, pistols, grenades, demolition gear. Weapons chosen because they could survive a parachute exit, a hard landing, and the first confused minutes on the ground. That is where the Model 12 becomes interesting. Because the strongest thing about its D-Day story is not proof, it is mismatch. The gun was famous. The gun was real. The gun was in U.S. service. The standard airborne record does not place it clearly among the normal jump arms over Normandy. The question here is not only what got used, it is why the weapons that worked best at close range so often became the ones people tried hardest to ban, bury, or drag into legend. The Model 12 sits in that gap. People remember the banned trench gun. The paperwork shows a protest, not a treaty ban. People assume Normandy because the weapon belongs to the American combat shotgun story. The airborne evidence points somewhere else. The forensic trail gets colder the closer you look. 5 rounds in the tube means limited sustained fire. A 12-gauge shell is bulky, heavier to carry than rifle cartridges round for round, and awkward in large quantities on a parachute drop already overloaded with ammunition, rations, grenades, and demolition charges. The sharper problem was the shell itself. Paper shotgun shells swelled in wet conditions. In damp air, in mud, in sustained exposure, the ammunition could become the weak point. The answer later was brass M19 buckshot. That fix helps explain why the shotgun's best combat reputation belongs more to other theaters and later wars than to the Normandy jump. Picture the arithmetic from a paratrooper's point of view. You are about to go out the door of a C-47 in darkness. You may land in flooded fields, hedgerows, orchards, or on a rooftop. You may lose your equipment bundle. You may spend hours assembling scattered men by sound and challenge word. A weapon for that job has to be compact enough to jump, light enough to carry after landing, and fed by ammunition you can distribute in quantity. Model 12 could dominate inside a few yards, but D-Day asked for something broader. Not one sudden room, a night spread across miles. So the shotgun's legend outran its place in the jump. The banned label stuck because it is clean and dramatic. September 19, 1918. Hague Article 23E. Threats of execution. Those numbers travel well. They make the weapon sound forbidden by law, when in fact it was protested by an enemy and retained by the United States. Then the Model 12 inherited the aura of the older 1897 and carried it forward into a second war where it really was bought in quantity. That is how myths harden. A legal threat becomes a ban. A genuine service weapon becomes a standard airborne weapon. One true thing drags a second, less certain thing behind it. The story survived for a simple reason. At the distances where men actually panic, 6 12-gauge shells solve arguments fast. Armies kept shotguns because they worked. Other armies objected because they worked. The Model 12 stayed in service long after June 1944, even though the Normandy jump itself seems to belong to carbines, rifles, and submachine guns instead. It was too specialized for the drop and too effective for war to discard. It was protested in 1918. It was procured in the tens of thousands from 1941 to 1944. It was remembered as banned. It was not. Number 1. M9A1 Bazooka. In the spring of 1944, at an airfield in England, Corporal Lewis E. Laird of the 101st Airborne was photographed climbing toward a C-47 with a 2.36-inch bazooka in the loadout. 16 pounds of launcher, a rocket nearly 20 inches long, a weapon built to break armor from the shoulder of a man who, a few hours later, might be scattered across French hedgerows in the dark. If that photograph proved D-Day paratroopers jumped the M9A1 Bazooka, it would settle the story in one image. The banned gun at the top of the list would also become one of the clearest answers to our running question. Why were the weapons that worked best so often the ones they tried hardest to ban or bury? It does not prove that. It points somewhere stranger. The launcher in that rehearsal image is identified in the source trail as an M9, not an M9A1. That sounds tiny. It is not. The difference is the whole point. On the night of June 5th to 6th, 1944, airborne anti-tank crews did not need a miracle. They needed a weapon that could survive a parachute jump. It had to land in pieces instead of as one awkward 5-foot tube. It had to be found in blacked-out fields, snapped together under stress, and fired at a German vehicle that might appear at 50 yards with no warning. The old, full-length M1A1 Bazooka could hit hard, but it was clumsy for a jump. The M9 solved that airborne problem by breaking into two sections. The M9A1 came after, as the tougher, wartime refinement of the same idea. Take the cold version seriously. The weapon most people place in the D-Day jump, the M9A1, may not have been the real jumper at all. Famous airborne bazooka story may belong mainly to the M9 and even the older M1A1, while the M9A1 is the hardened descendant that arrived just after the moment that made the legend. What gets remembered as one iconic gun may really be a blurred family photo. That blur matters because this is how banned stories get built. By December 1944, U.S. Army Ordnance described the M9A1 in dry, exact terms. Caliber, 2.36 inches or 60 millimeters. Weight, 16 pounds. Length assembled, 60 inches. Broken down, two 31-inch sections. Roll, shoulder fired against tanks, armored vehicles, pillboxes, and emplacements. It still launched the same basic answer to armor the airborne wanted all along, the 2.36-inch heat rocket M6A3, a 3.4-pound round with half a pound of pentolite in the warhead, moving at 265 feet per second with a listed range of 600 yards. In Normandy, those numbers turn physical fast. You are standing in wet grass after a bad landing. Men are missing. Bundles are missing. The hedgerows are taller than expected. Somewhere on the lane beyond them, there may be a self-propelled gun, or an armored car, or just a machine gun position dug into a bank that has to be cracked now, not after daylight. A two-piece launcher matters there more than a more powerful one. 31 inches can be carried. 60 inches catches on everything. That was the airborne logic. The key improvement of the M9A1 was almost plain. Not a bigger rocket, not a new caliber, not some dramatic leap in armor penetration. A stronger tube coupling. That was the upgrade. A tougher joint where the launcher came together, meant to survive rough handling. Parachute troops gave rough handling to everything they owned. Drop it, slam it, get separated from it, find it later, reassemble it fast. The M9A1 was not a new answer to the anti-tank problem. It was the same answer, reinforced for abuse. The romance of the D-Day bazooka has to be handled carefully. The airborne needed this kind of weapon desperately, but the available evidence points to M9 or M1A1 launchers in the Normandy jump context, not confidently to true M9A1s on June 6th itself. Multiple sources place the M9A1 standardization or production on the far side of the D-Day window. The strongest version of the story is not that paratroopers dropped into Normandy with a superweapon no one talks about. It is that engineers were already solving the right problem and then solved it better just after the jump. That sounds smaller. It reveals more. The M9A1 shows how combat selects for practical brutality. The launcher had to be light enough for one man, compact enough for an aircraft load, simple enough for darkness, and destructive enough to matter when armor showed up too close for comfort. Even the rocket's shape tells that story. The M6A3 was not just explosive, its form changed. U.S. ordnance sheets describe a hemispherical ogive and cylindrical fins, design fixes aimed at handling and impact reliability, not just raw power. The weapon evolved where soldiers actually suffered. Transport, breakage, bad landings, hurried assembly, ugly short-range shots. Old military hardware often becomes awkward in peacetime for exactly that reason. A launcher with a bore over 1/2 inch and live rockets behind it does not slide neatly into the modern civilian world. Under current U.S. destructive device law, that combination lands in heavily regulated territory. Not because the M9A1 was evil, and not because lawmakers misunderstood it, but because it was so plainly built for one thing: sending an explosive anti-armor projectile from a shoulder at targets no police report wants to describe in detail. The weapons that fit war perfectly tend to fit peace very badly. So the M9A1 ends up at the peak of a list like this even with the date problem attached. It sits right on the seam between myth and function. People want the clean version: D-Day, Paratrooper, Bazooka, done. One gun, one jump, one legend. The real story is messier and better. The airborne requirement produced the M9's two-piece solution. Normandy proved why that solution mattered. Then the M9A1 hardened the weak point with a stronger coupling, turning a clever launcher into a rougher, more dependable one. The famous moment and the finished version are almost the same thing. Almost. That almost is where the mechanism shows. Collapse M9 into M9A1 and the story gets simpler, but you lose how armies really improve weapons, not through cinematic reinvention, through the fix that keeps a tube from failing after it is dropped out of an airplane with the rest of a man's life. These weapons became hard to classify, easy to mythologize, and later drifted into legal or historical gray zones. They worked in the one environment that mattered most to the men carrying them. So they lasted. So they spread. Later generations tightened the law around them or blurred the record until a near match became the accepted memory. The M9A1 was not the great lost bazooka of D-Day. The strengthened version of the bazooka D-Day had already proven it needed. That makes it more than a correction. It makes it the final pattern in the segment. The guns that endure are not always the ones remembered cleanly. Sometimes they are remembered badly precisely because they worked so well that every version of the story wants to claim them. In one surviving line from the period, the requirement was stated without romance at all: for tanks, armored vehicles, pillboxes, and emplacements.